Venezuela pushback. As the Biden administration looks for other sources of oil and gasoline outside of the United States, Venezuela is being considered as one substitute to replace banned Russian oil. But Republicans aren't the only ones opposing that course of action. Even some Democrats, like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, don't think dealing with President Nicolas Maduro is a good idea.
To me, he's a bad man.
Well, here with more is Venezuelan economist and policy writer Daniel Di Martino. Daniel, good to see you again. So please explain for our viewers, those who may not be familiar with what's happening in Venezuela, why should Venezuela not be considered to fill the U.S. oil and gas gap?
Yeah, well, Venezuela was one of the main partners of the United States and main exporters of oil to the United States in the many decades ago, and still until a couple decades ago. What happened was that 23 years ago, Hugo Chavez took over in Venezuela. That was approximately the same year that I was born. And the consequence was he totally destroyed our country. He transformed our democratic, free, and prosperous nation into a socialist state with now 6 million of us as refugees outside of the world, outside of our country. And that the oil industry was massacred to try to overthrow and to try to reduce revenue to these human rights violator, to these horrible murderers who are in power and drug dealers in Venezuela. The U.S. stopped importing oil in 2019 from Venezuela, which we produce very little anyway. Now Biden is trying to get that revived for just a few hundred, maybe 100,000 barrels of oil per day, trading our freedom, trading our human rights for a little bit of money that isn't even enough to make a difference.
Well, explain to us, how are the people currently faring under Nicolas Maduro? Any better than before? Because I know the bolivar is one of the weakest currencies in the world now. One bolivar, I guess, used to be 1 million. It's now actually worth less than 25 cents U.S.
Yeah. Look, what happened in Venezuela was that because the government started taking over private businesses, and then the few private businesses that were left, the regime started placing price controls on them. The economy was just left starving, and people started starving because there were shortages of goods, because there was hyperinflation. Venezuela still has the highest inflation in the world. In 2019, it had 1,000,000% inflation, and it has one of the longest running hyperinflations in world history, which is also a record. For several years of hyperinflation. And that is what has caused so many of us, like my family, who in the early 2000s were making a few $1,000s a month, like most Americans, to making $100 a month. Things have changed recently for the better because the sanctions that Trump implemented forced the regime to dollarize the economy inside. And so over half of the population now makes their income in US dollars from remittances, but also from working in the country. And that has protected a big portion of the population from hyperinflation.
So this would reverse that? Is that what you're saying? Or if we start buying oil from Venezuela again?
If Biden does sanction reliefs to Venezuela, the regime is going to get a new, very powerful revenue source for them that it's going to allow them to, one, buy weapons, but two, also revert all the economic reforms that they did that at least have stopped the destruction of our purchasing power in Venezuela.
Diplomatically, Nicolas Maduro just released 2 American prisoners, one a Citgo oil executive. Why do you think he did that? And why do you think the Biden administration sought those 2 for release when there are, I think, 10 other Americans being held?
That's right. This is all part of the strategy of the Maduro regime. And Biden sent 2 of his closest advisors to Venezuela in a charter flight. One of them, Juan Gonzalez, who is his national security advisor for the Western Hemisphere. And with all honesty, Gary, these are clueless people. These are people who think that it is an achievement if Maduro just sits down and negotiates, which is something that he has done for 20 years. Because the thing that Maduro and Chavez loved was to sit down and negotiate with never ending anything in sight. And that's what they do because it stops protests, it keeps people calm, and that's what they want. So it's not an achievement of Biden if Maduro negotiates. It's actually a failure.
Maduro supports Putin and Russia and Ukraine, and the opposition leader Juan Guaido supports Zelensky and the Ukrainians. So what are the chances that Maduro and the opposition can reach an agreement on anything?
There are no chances because one, the opposition doesn't have anything to give Maduro in return for freedom for the Venezuelan people. This is supposed to be a strategy of Biden to counter Russia. He's helping Russia's ally. Just a day before he sent his advisors to Venezuela, the Russian ambassador to Venezuela was in a meeting with Maduro and a bunch of his paid crowd, chanting that we stand with Russia against Ukraine. So who is Biden really helping here? He's helping Russia.
And so then, Daniel, what should the policy of the United States be? What policy should we pursue with Venezuela?
Well, the policy that should be pursued is, one, you do not negotiate with terrorists because there's nothing that you can give them in Venezuela that is not keeping Venezuelans under tyranny, right? So that's exactly what they're not willing to give away. So we should not negotiate with the Maduro regime. We should keep sanctions in place. And if anything, we should be funding groups. We should be funding humanitarian aid, but we should also be funding groups that seek the freedom of Venezuelans from inside. Look, Venezuela is not going to be free because we do just regular peaceful activities. That's a reality.
Okay, standing up for freedom, Daniel Di Martino, economist and policy writer. Thank you, Daniel, for providing those insights.
Thank you for having me, Gary.